Hi, it's Rhett Power from Inc.com here at the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. We've been here all week in sunny California. I've got Macon Phillips with me from the State Department. Macon has got an interesting history. He's worked on the 2008, President Obama's 2008 campaign, was one of the team members that really changed the way presidential campaigns do social media. You've worked in the White House now on digital strategy. Now you're at the State Department working on how we communicate our message around the world. Macon, we always talk about business and how business uses technology to communicate to customers. How does the government do it?
Well, first off, it's great to be here, and thanks for having me on
Right.
to have this discussion. President Obama kind of summed it up for me a few years ago when he was talking about public diplomacy, which is the area I work in now at the State Department, when he said that the United States doesn't just build alliances with other countries, that we build alliances with ordinary people. And what technology has allowed us to do is do that much more rapidly, at greater scale, and in much more interesting and interactive ways. And so when you look at our time from the presidential campaign early on, through the White House and now at State, it's not simply about using technology to broadcast your message more effectively or be more clever or what have you. That's important, but it's also about developing networks with people, having a true sense of empathy and interest in what people want to tell you and collaborating with them, which is to kind of bring it to why we're here today about, in this case, the entrepreneurship community, which isn't just to have them come and hear why America's so great, but actually have the U.S. be a participant in a network of entrepreneurs around the world, and that will pay dividends for us moving forward.
Okay. So what is, I think the way the government communicates is transformed, obviously, as technology changes. You have to evolve, the department has to evolve. How have you changed the way State Department communicates around the world using social media in different ways, and using technology in different ways?
There's been a great amount of change just in the last few years since I arrived, and there certainly was already a lot of change underway. Mm-hmm. I think the area that we're really focused on right now is this idea of network building. For example, we have the Young African Leaders Initiative, which is nearly 250,000 young leaders across the continent of Africa that are organizing events in their own communities, that are taking online courses, that are coming to various trainings. And we have these networks on pretty much every continent, not really Antarctica, but everywhere else. And this is definitely something that's near and dear to the president's own heart and his own interest. What we're also seeing is the use of social media and public engagement move out of the traditional communications and public diplomacy role within the State Department and actually see other political parts of the State Department using it, ambassadors using it. Our ambassador in Ukraine really moved things quite a bit forward during the Maidan and the years after by being a participant in the conversations that were happening on social media about the situation in Ukraine. And not simply just putting out photos of the July 4th party or sending that stuff,
Using
but
it as
actually
a poster board, but more engagement. More.
He was the pots and pans ambassador. He was someone who was raising awareness around the world about what was happening on Maidan, and then in the weeks and months and years after, has been a participant in the conversation that civil society is having, including that conversation on social media. And that's happening all around the world by our ambassadors being more forward-leaning, by our public diplomacy officers being smarter about how to support that kind of work. It's a really exciting trend.
So it sounds like it really can help further diplomacy in a lot of ways, in ways that you haven't been able to do that, or the U.S. government hasn't been able to do that in the past.
But when we talk about social media strategy, I think that there's a tendency for people to say, how can I tweet better? I really want to Facebook harder, and get more likes or what have you. I think you have to start by first asking, what have I learned from social media? My social media strategy shouldn't be about how I do social media. It's how my business or my government strategy has adapted to a world that's affected by social media. And we could go on a tour around the world and talk about a number of countries where there's been a profound impact of greater connectedness, greater freedom of information, greater awareness about issues, good and bad. Right. And the government has to adapt to that reality.
Right.
And we've done some of that at the White House to sort of focus domestically. It's certainly something that animates our own foreign policy.
Does it worry you because social media moves so fast? Does it worry you that somebody tweets something that isn't right, or do you encourage the staffs to move quickly with it and to respond, or is it like a lot of things? Does it take a lot more time? Do things have to go through a process? How do you work in this sort of rapid environment that is social media?
This has been very difficult, and it started. My own experience started even on the campaign in 2008, when there was a lot of lies and things said about then Senator Obama that just weren't true, and we really got ourselves all twisted in knots about how to do that kind of rapid response, how to engage with that. Fast forward through the healthcare advocacy phase of trying to get that legislation passed and all the things about death panels and all the things that are out there, into now when you look around the world, the misinformation that's happening that's put forward by Kremlin-backed media throughout Eastern Europe, when we look at all sorts of ideas that aren't necessarily true but are received by audiences, to your point, much more quickly than we can respond. We have to step back and say, rather than try to chase and play whack-a-mole on every mistruth, it's really important that we are being proactive with our own message, to not necessarily respond to not respond to misinformation alone, but to actually inoculate vulnerable audiences who might receive that wisdom and believe it. So what that means specifically is looking at parts of Eastern Europe and parts of the world where we know that Kremlin-backed media is trying to drive certain narratives, both by their investments in media and some of the content they were putting out. And rather than say, but that's not true because of this, that's not true because of that, make sure that we've identified what those populations actually think about the West and Western values, and that we are addressing that proactively. And you could walk around the world and find a number of other areas for that. But I think for any organization, what that means is you have to survey what your vulnerabilities are, what you would anticipate the kinds of misinformation would be deployed against you, and develop a strategy to proactively inoculate those vulnerable audiences to that misinformation. Otherwise, you're just going to be forever chasing these lies around the globe.
And that sounds complicated when you're talking about 200-something countries. And
it's super complicated, and I would be lying to say that we had it all figured out. I mean, it's absolutely been a growing challenge that everyone's aware of, and I think everyone's quite focused on how this works. And it's something that in the last 8-10 years has grown exponentially. But on the other hand, there's been a positive outcome from all of this. The kinds of connections that an increasingly networked society makes possible, whether it's in entrepreneurship, whether it's in civil society, or whether it's in human rights, making sure that people are aware of injustices that are happening, helping journalists report the stories that needed to be reported to fight corruption in certain countries, making sure that we see the kinds of support getting to the people we want to succeed around the world. That's a very encouraging sign. So it's not all gloom and doom, but that's certainly been a problem.
Looking at sort of like the projecting here and looking ahead, what do you think the next administration's biggest challenges are around the world in terms of communication? What technologies do you see that are emerging in the private sector that government can take advantage of?
Well, I think that there are a number of challenges that are only going to become more significant. One of the principal challenges is declining trust in institutions, and that includes the government. It includes, in many places, the U.S. government. Government communicators are oftentimes not the most effective messengers, and that's not a technology problem. Perhaps it's exacerbated by easier word of mouth marketing and these kinds of networks being formed. But for us, it's going to require adapting to that reality and actually doing a better job of identifying and cultivating allies who share our interests but may be a more effective messenger. And this is a play that makes total sense when we're talking about combating radical extremism.
Right.
It makes total sense when we're talking about arguing for trade agreements.
Right.
Whatever the agenda is for the United States, it's really important in this sort of increasingly fractured yet interconnected world to understand which messengers are going to resonate with which audiences. And so I think some of the technologies that are exciting that way are the kinds of tools that can help you do that audience analysis and identification that can really help us prioritize audiences and not treat the internet or the world as one monolith. I mean, that's the exciting world we're in now.
I mean, has the State Department and the government in and of itself reshaped the sort of the infrastructure or how you position people to do this? I mean, are your embassies in your places around the world? Are you adding different staff? How are you doing that in so many different places?
Well, I think now's the time we should disclose your personal bias in this whole thing, right? You know, that your wife works in the State Department and knows probably as well as anyone else that it's not an institution known for rapid change.
Right.
And this is something...
Is that what it needs, though? I mean,
I don't think it's so much rapid change, although that would be nice. But I think it's intentional change with the goal of being more data-driven,
right.
Of being more collaborative. The State Department historically is an organization that focuses on government-to-government relationships. And we now have a world that's mostly about people-to-people relationships. And like these entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley, it's great that the president came, and it's great that the secretary came and all these other government folks who are all wearing suits, and I'm not wearing a tie, so it's I've relaxed a little bit. But what's really important are all the American entrepreneurs and investors who are meeting with these entrepreneurs and investors from around the world. That's going to be something the State Department has to adapt to support, and it's not in our DNA historically. We're much better at putting on suits, getting in a plane, going to a government building, signing some things, doing the thing, and so that in many ways I think mimics the evolution we've seen in American politics in the sense that we've had rapid growth of field efforts and online organizing efforts that involve people in the enterprise in a way that 20 years ago, 40 years ago, they didn't. It was all TV ads and to some extent voter turnout on election day. We're going to need to be more collaborative moving forward. There's also some very basic things that we're doing. For example, implementing a CRM, trying to get smart about how we manage our relationships over time. We spend lots of money, millions of people go through exchange programs, and it's at times difficult to identify those a few years later, particularly in a standard way, where an officer in a country might drop in to that country and say, who are all the alumni who are interested in this issue that have been to the United States in the last 10 years? I want to follow up with them. Right. And there's some technology systems that can really help with that. But ultimately, all the technology in the world won't solve the problem until the organization adapts its intent to be more collaborative with non-state actors. And the world is changing in a way that's making that obvious. I think people at the State Department get that need to evolve. It's just hard sometimes for these large organizations to change so quickly.
Any not just government. I mean, that's big companies, big.
And I'll say one last thing about just that, not to paint too negative a picture on it. My bias is that I'm in Washington, and there's a large organization there. But since we're here in this context of entrepreneurs and startups, that's one of the really exciting parts about state is the embassies are a very different animal. When you've got an embassy with a team of maybe 1 or 3 public affairs officers in a small country in Africa, for example, they have scarcity. They are going to innovate. They're far away from the mothership. And even though that mothership may exert some influence on them and control, to some extent they're free to try new things. And so the most exciting examples of this innovation, this evolution towards real collaboration and participation with non-state actors is happening at the embassy. It's not happening in the ivory tower of the State Department at Foggy Bottom. And being part of an organization that is comprised of so many of those startups, so many of those more entrepreneurial teams in the field, is really invigorating.
So I'm going to switch gears completely. We're here in California this week to talk about entrepreneurship. There are 75 million young people around the world that are unemployed. We heard Mark Zuckerberg this morning talk about 7 billion people in the world. 4 billion don't have access to technology. Is entrepreneurship, and I know this is out of the scope, but you think entrepreneurship is the answer? And how can the U.S. government, what's the U.S. government's role in trying to help get people more access so that we can level the playing field around the world?
Yeah, well, I think that it was great that Mark Zuckerberg was able to attend today. I mean, he made a really great contribution. And I was struck by his comment that to him, entrepreneurship is about the change you seek, not the company you want to create.
Right.
And I thought that's a very simple way of thinking about it. And it's applicable both to entrepreneurship in the private sector, but also social entrepreneurship. And so, yes, I think entrepreneurship is a huge part of what of the solutions to a lot of the challenges that we have. Having traveled now to a number of countries, I'm very cognizant of the value as an American that I have for independence and self-initiative. I think it's something that we take for granted.
That's the takeaway right
there. And it's there's a lot of people that don't have a lot of self-initiative. I've had my days, but I think in our country there's just so much hustle. And
is that what we're promoting? I mean,
I
think that's what we're promoting.
Yeah, and
here,
I think
right?
that I think that what happens is you go to other places that have historically had so much of their wealth and capital and power concentrated in the government that people have it's created a dependency. And even though there's hustle, particularly in the younger generation, I mean, the statistics about just how many people are below the age of 35 around the world is just startling. There's no history or precedent for that kind of self-initiative, which is really, to my mind, what entrepreneurship is. It's having a change you seek coupled with the self-initiative to follow it through. And so what we can do first is set a good example, and we don't do that by trotting out our government folks. We do that by bringing out these amazing entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley and from around the country. But I think the second thing that's really exciting about what the United States can do is work with other governments who have an interest in this sector growing, who've seen what's happened here and want that themselves, and say, well, you need better intellectual property protections, right? Let's talk about some of your trade. By the way, you need to educate your people, and you're not going to retain talent in your country if you don't have a healthy civil society and basic freedoms.
And a healthy legal system. And
all of those things. So there's a role for government in creating the framework and the infrastructure for entrepreneurship, but ultimately what America's example is to everyone else is it's outside of government where that real change happens. And that was the energy from this conference that was so contagious.
Macon?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Live from the Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Palo Alto, California at Stanford.